Hi everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. I'm Melissa, your membership director from the Harmonie Club. I'm so pleased to see so many members logged in for a virtual session this evening, featuring our very own Dr. Sarah Schlesinger Hirschfeld. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please monitor your muting so we can be respectful to the presenters who are logged in tonight. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the program using the chat feature in the Zoom toolbar. I will be monitoring the questions tonight, and Sarah will be taking them away from there. Feel free to keep your video on or off, whatever you feel comfortable with. This session is being recorded and will be added to our virtual Clubhouse resources on our website. As always, I encourage members to stay informed with the Clubhouse happenings through our e-newsletters and staying up to date with our events calendar on our website and mobile app. Dr. Sarah Schlesinger Hirschfeld is an associate professor of clinical investigation and senior attending physician and chair of the Institutional Review Board at the Rockefeller University. We will learn about new developments in the race to create and roll out safe and effective vaccines to prevent COVID-19. She will discuss the different vaccines and how they work to the end of the pandemic as we face our second year of COVID-19, but things are very well looking up. So from there, Sarah, I will let you take it away.
Melissa, thank you for arranging this. And I'm delighted to be here virtually. I only wish that I could be here where you are in real life, and that we could be gathered and sharing a cocktail before we discuss this. But I guess we wouldn't be discussing it if that were the case. So it is my great honor to be here, and we are celebrating what is now the first anniversary of the pandemic. As many of you may know or not know, I've been doing these sorts of Zoom discussions for our synagogue, for school, for my aunt's book group over the course of the last year. And as I was preparing to do this one, I was struck by how much happier and lighter and genuinely more optimistic I feel now than I have felt at any time in the last year. And we really can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're not there yet, though. And the challenge is how we get there as expeditiously, as quickly, and as safely as we possibly can. And so that's really what I would like to discuss tonight. And as Melissa mentioned, we have this sort of two huge events in the pandemic, if you will. We have the rollout of these wonderful vaccines, which are nothing short of a miracle. And then we have the virus, which is a very smart virus, evolving as all viruses do, and forming variants, which are, like all viruses do, working to evade our efforts to control the virus. And so how we thoughtfully and effectively win is what I would like to discuss tonight. So I would like to start by just giving you a tiny bit of background about me. And some of you I know me, and for those of you who do, including my beloved mother, who I saw is here, and my husband, forgive me. But I am a physician scientist, and I have only an MD. I don't have a PhD, but I've spent my entire professional life, which is now 40 years plus, working on the relationship between viruses and the immune system, and in the last 25 years, how to develop vaccines to teach the immune system to fight viruses. Now, in all honesty, though I have found this a fascinating line of work and spend a tremendous amount of time up at night thinking about these burning questions, it hasn't been of great interest to too many other people. And you could ask my kids. I have 5 sons, and all of them roll their eyes when I start talking about vaccines, because I've done it a lot in their lives. And all of a sudden, in the last year, now my work has become of great interest to everybody. And I really can't wait for the day when it goes back to being of very little interest to anybody. But for now, if it can be useful and help, I'm delighted, and I appreciate your time. I would really like this to be interactive, and I would like to answer your questions as best I can. So as Melissa said, please put your questions in the chat. In my experience in doing these, it works better when I'm fed the questions by the moderator, because many of you, like me, I'm perpetually putting myself on mute and talking. And I think the quote of the year for 2020 or 2021 is going to be, "You're on mute." at least in my life. So I think that the best thing to do is um, let Melissa feed me the questions. But I'd like to frame this in that we are facing, going into the second year of the worst public health crisis that any of us have faced. It is the worst public health crisis the world has faced in a century. Even people like me who worry about these things, and I was worried last December, had no idea of the catastrophe that has befallen the world and us. With that said, the full-on miracle of the vaccines that have been developed to combat the coronavirus are without parallel. So the one thing that I always have to be careful not to forget is my condolences go out to all of you who have lost somebody, or those of you who've been ill. And I know that there are people in our community who have suffered both, and many people who I know who have COVID and are continuing to suffer with what's called long COVID. This virus is a remarkable virus, and it is remarkable in how polymorphic, how differently it can affect different people. And so I think we have to be mindful of the fact that even though we're talking about ending the pandemic in a global sense and in a theoretical sense, there are many people whose lives will be forever, devastatingly changed by the events of this past year. And my condolences go to those people, and I just think it's really important for us all to continue to be mindful of that. With that said, when I lectured at the Rockefeller on vaccines in the clinical immunology class, which I've done for I can't even tell you how many years, I have a slide that says it takes 10 years to develop a vaccine from the time you isolate the organism. The shortest time it's ever taken to develop a vaccine in modern history is 4 years. And that was Maurice Hillman developed the measles vaccine from an isolate that he swabbed from his daughter's throat. And that was in 1964. And there were a whole bunch of reasons that that went extraordinarily well. And it has been held up as a pinnacle of vaccine development and something that would never be achieved again. And the fact that both Moderna and Pfizer have developed vaccines using a completely new technology, RNA, messenger RNA, that have efficacy of 95% approximately in the clinical trials. One is 94 and one is 95, but those are effectively the same number, is truly nothing short of a miracle. And the results of these trials were announced on Hanukkah, and I said to everybody in my life, this is a full-on Hanukkah miracle. And then it turned out that there were extra doses in the vials, and that just seemed to completely consolidate my notion of that this was a Hanukkah miracle up there with the miracle of the oil. And I say that because most of us in the field were hoping that a vaccine would be about 70 to 75% effective. The FDA had put the bar for approving or giving an EUA, which is the emergency approval, the emergency use authorization, which is how these vaccines are being used, at 50%. So if it protected 50% of the people who received it, it was going to go forward. And these are as good or better than any vaccine we receive, which is really nothing short of a miracle. And beyond that, that's to prevent symptomatic infection. But what's most important is these vaccines and the J&J vaccines are 100% effective in the clinical trials in protecting from severe disease and death.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, you're muted. You're muted. Unmute. We all had our muted moments. That really
sorry. I was muted. I don't know where I got muted, and it was that I was very emphatic about all of the vaccines, including the J&J vaccine, which is slightly less efficacious, but still really terrific, are 100% efficacious in the clinical trials at preventing severe disease and death. And that's really what we need any vaccine to prevent, right? In any given year, between sometimes 5 and sometimes 50,000 Americans die of influenza. Many of us get the flu shot. The flu shots, I don't know, a few years ago was 23% efficacious in terms of preventing infection, but they prevent severe disease and death. And that is good for the people for whom they save, but it is also extraordinarily important for the hospital system, right? For the healthcare system, because our biggest risk a year ago, though individually, of course, we were all at risk and that was devastating, was that the healthcare system was going to be completely overwhelmed and there was going to be the end of civil society. We were riding down the West Side Highway this weekend, and we were reminiscing about how we had driven last, I guess it was April, to see the good ship Comfort, the Navy ship that had been sent to New York to allow, to take care of the people for whom there wasn't room in the hospitals. Now, fortunately, it never came to that, and that was largely because of the lockdown, and we didn't go out. But severe disease and death is what needs to be protected from, both for the individual and for the collective. And these vaccines do it as well as any vaccine that we have. They're safe and they're effective. And that is what's going to get us out of the pandemic. So the problem is that we developed vaccines, but getting them made and getting them in vials, which I can't remember now if it was July or August, the big issue in the people with whom I was speaking was there weren't enough of the stoppers, the rubber stoppers for the vials. There are still issues with the number of vials and the number of needles needed to vaccinate the rest of the world. All of these things, nobody ever needed this many of them before. So the vaccines are made, they're in vials, but they have to get into people's arms. And that takes time. And so there's both the issue of manufacturing, what's called filling and finishing, that's getting it into the vial, distributing it, and then, getting it out there. No spoiler alert intended, but for many of us who will be watching President Biden in an hour or now 45 minutes, I got a little alert on my phone before I sat down to do this, saying that President Biden is now going to say that there are going to be sufficient vaccines for every adult who wants one to have one by May 1st. So that's, 6 weeks away. That is amazing. And that is key because we have this sort of war, if you will, of the getting people vaccinated so they're protected, so the virus doesn't replicate in people, and then the virus replicating in people, and during its replication, there are mutations, and that's how the variants form. So my own view, which is, I think reflects the view of the CDC guidance and the view of public health authorities, but I would tell you, and I don't always agree with them, as anybody who knows me well will attest, we need to be cautious because we need to get enough people vaccinated so we start to get to something like herd immunity. And we need to do that in a way that prevents the emergence of more virulent variants. So all viruses mutate, and they typically mutate to be more transmissible and less lethal. And it looked in the beginning as though what's called the UK variant had, and I'm not going to use the numbers for them because they confuse me. And if something confuses me, I kind of figure it's likely to confuse everybody else as well. But it looks as though the UK variant here is indeed more transmissible, but is not causing more morbidity and mortality. So that's really good news. The other piece of good news that I still think is tremendously important to remember, masks work. They work really well if you wear them. So while we're in this interim period where some people are vaccinated and some aren't, mask wearing, particularly in public, continues to be very important. So, there is this sense among those of us who are vaccinated, and I'm vaccinated, that we're protected because we are. And I actually think that the vaccines have been undersold in terms of the degree of protection that they confer. And as I think many of you may have seen, the CDC released guidance on Monday saying that adults who are fully vaccinated, and that means having received 2 shots of the Pfizer or 2 shots of the Moderna or a single shot of the J&J, and then 2 weeks have elapsed, that's considered fully vaccinated, can gather indoors without masks, without social distancing safely. And they added that you could, include a single household of unvaccinated adults if they were young and not at risk. And the reason for this is obviously because most young people haven't had access to the vaccine, and it's a risk analysis for them. So with that, I see, are there
We do.
questions in the chat? You want to?
So from there, without further ado, should we head to our Q&A portion?
Right.
Okay. So we have a question saying, should one get an A/B test post-vaccination to assess immunity? If so, which A/B test?
Okay, so that's a very good question. So what I noticed that the person who's asking it, Dr. Gutstein, is an MD. So an A/B test is an antibody test. And an antibody test is a measurement of immunity. So before the vaccines, it was a measure, it meant you had been exposed to the virus and you had mounted an immune response. Now it means you've either been exposed or more likely you've mounted an immune response because you've received a vaccine. Now, I am an anxious person. I am an anxious person on a good day. And lately I've been more anxious. However, anxiety should not rule the day, though in some measure, I suppose it does at this time. I think the antibody tests are tremendously useful now. I would just like to add that at the beginning of the pandemic, a year ago, and even into the summer and fall, they weren't so reliable. So it was hard to know. You could get a positive result, it was really negative. You could get a negative result, and it's really positive. So they could be confusing and frankly more dangerous than not having the result. My own view is that if you've been vaccinated and the time has passed, it's not necessary. I have several colleagues who've gone ahead and done it. My husband was having blood drawn for another reason, so we added it to what was being drawn. The only reason that I would do it is if there was some doubt in your mind. If you had the vaccine in some place and you had absolutely no reaction, your arm didn't even hurt at all, and that worried you. But I feel pretty confident very confident that these vaccines work. The problem also with an antibody test, if you do it, within the few weeks after getting the second shot, that makes sense. But once 3 months have elapsed, you could well be immune and not have an antibody, because the immune system has 2 arms, the antibody part and the cellular part, the B cells and the T cells, sort of the inside baseball terms. And antibodies are very easy to measure, and T cells are very hard to measure. And there is no clinical test for T cells for anything. They can be measured in a clinical, very sophisticated clinical lab, say at Memorial Sloan Kettering for cancer responses, but there's no easy clinical test. And it is the T cell arm of the immune system that largely fights the viruses. And so what happens with any immune response to this virus or any other is when you're exposed to the virus or to a vaccine, you make a big response, and then it comes down and you're left with what's called memory. And that memory is very hard to measure. So you could be protected and not have an antibody. And that's why, unless you were to do it within the first, say, 6 to 8 weeks after being vaccinated, I wouldn't even worry if it were negative. Hope that helps. And in terms of which one, I don't have an opinion about which one. I'm not expert on. I know there's a very good one that colleagues of mine swear by from Mount Sinai. There's an investigator there named Florian Kramer, who's an expert on antibody and antibody fractionation and immunity. And he's developed one that's commercially available. Florian Kramer is his name. And he's been quoted in the Times a lot. He's a really smart, capable guy. Colleagues of mine have chosen to get that one, but I think pretty much any of them now are reliable. What is my opinion of Pfizer versus Moderna versus J&J? Okay, well, I am full of opinions about those vaccines. but my opinions are about their utility in terms of public health. As an individual, the best vaccine is the one you can get. Um, I got the Pfizer vaccine because that was the one I was offered. I would have preferred the Moderna vaccine because I know people who were involved in developing it. Well, that doesn't make it better, but it gave me like a, sort of an inside feeling for it. Um, the the Pfizer vaccine requires waiting 3 weeks from one shot to the second shot. So that's a bit of an advantage. You get full immunity a week sooner than the Moderna vaccine. Um, Other than that, they are Coke and Pepsi as far as I'm concerned. The J&J vaccine has many advantages from a public health point of view. The first, and obviously, and even from an individual point of view, it's a single shot. The logistics of coming back for a second shot and doing it on a large scale are tremendously challenging, and doing it at the right time, because it though probably there's more leeway with it immunologically than the approval states. In the United States, we're doing it within the approval. So it really has to be a tight window when you come back. The J&J vaccine is one and done, and that is terrific. It also doesn't require the cold storage that it was thought that the RNA vaccines required. It turns out that they probably don't require that cold storage. So when you develop a vaccine or any drug, you present a dossier to the FDA, and the FDA opines on that dossier. So remember, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines began development a year ago. I mean, which is, again, every time I say that, I get goosebumps. And they stacked everything so it would be the most likely to succeed, because that was absolutely necessary. And so the colder you keep something, the more likely it is to be stable. So when you're developing a vaccine, you have to do what's called stability testing. And that means you take a vial and you hold it at the conditions that you're asking the FDA to allow you to hold it for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Before the pandemic, you had to have 6 months stability testing to even talk to them. And the only kind of label, the only permission you can get is reflected in your stability testing. So both Pfizer and Moderna very wisely said, okay, the most likely thing that's going to work is -80. And you wouldn't have wanted to pick -20, which is a regular freezer, and then have the whole thing not work. So they picked -80, and that's what got approved, or that's what was approved under the EUA. They've gone back now and done additional testing, and it turns out you can probably use a regular freezer too. And I'm not entirely sure where the approvals for that fall are, where they are in the approval process. But if they're not approved to be kept at the higher temperatures, they will be soon. But J&J, because of the platform they were using, and they knew from prior work that these could be kept at a warmer temperature, they are. And so that's hugely important. That means they can be brought into people's homes. That means they don't expire. That means you can give one shot and be done. So those differences, though tremendously important when somebody like me is thinking about them and how they get used and all that, make no difference to the person receiving them. And yes, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is in the trial somewhat less efficacious in preventing infection, but it is no less efficacious at preventing severe disease and death. And that's what you really want to have happen. And frankly, the platform is a more established platform, and it may be more durable. It may not be, but smart money is, and it may last a little bit longer. The data, I don't have data to support that, but certainly there are reasons to think that might be the case. So they're all good. There's not one that I would say don't get, and there's not one that I would say definitely get over the others, except for Moderna, because people who I know helped develop it, and that's not really a reason. So they're all good. As I said, the one you can get is the one to get.
I think that's a very comforting answer.
Right. Interestingly, and this is a little off what you asked. The Sputnik vaccine, which is the Russian vaccine, which is developed in a more traditional way, which wasn't tested, it was just made. So remember, the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine were made almost a year ago, but they were tested, they were developed, they were first tested in animals and then tested in small and then larger clinical trials. So they weren't approved till the beginning of December. They weren't under the EUA. In Russia, they didn't go through that process. They made the thing and then they started manufacturing and using it. So the early use of it was published in the Lancet, which is a very distinguished British medical journal, last week, the week before, time blurs, but recently, and it actually works very well. It works like 85%. It's 85% efficacious in preventing infection, and again, 100% efficacious in preventing severe disease and death, as they could tell. And so that one's actually a good vaccine as well. And they're using it as a diplomatic tool, not surprisingly, and providing it because they were able to make buckets of it, providing it to places in the world where they don't have access to the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. But I was told by a colleague of mine who has friends in the former Czechoslovakia that there's all this bad press about the Pfizer vaccine because they're really pushing the Sputnik vaccine. A friend of mine's parents still live in Moscow, and he was asking me what I thought of it. And I said, would it be the vaccine that I would choose? No, but if I could get it, I would get it if that was the one I could get because it works. It seems efficacious and it seems safe as well. So, it's not that there's a single vaccine. We fortunately have many. And it will be interesting to see how that all plays out.
I agree. I'm very curious to see that. And we have a very similar question coming in, contingent on what was discussed previously. So should we be concerned that these vaccines were approved on an emergency basis? You had mentioned before that most trials are 4 years, et cetera. So,
right. So there's no question these things were pushed through. I will tell you, fortunately, and when I've reviewed the primary data, not the primary data, but all the published data, they appear very, very safe. There is no question that in the usual course of business, something wouldn't have been moved this fast. But and this is a theme that I have, and Melissa and I were talking earlier today, and this is a theme I have with all sorts of decisions around COVID. It's a risk analysis, right? You have to make a decision for yourself and your family where the greater risk lies. If there were no COVID, would anybody be getting a vaccine that took a year to develop? Probably not. You'd probably want to see more safety data in the clinical trials. You'd probably want to see more, more stability data. The agency would almost certainly want those things. But given the risk that we face in getting infected with COVID, there's no question in my mind that these vaccines are far safer than that. And I think they're very safe. I wish I could, I'm not so tech savvy. I could show you the picture of me getting vaccinated. My mother's vaccinated, my husband's vaccinated, my children who can be vaccinated are vaccinated, and the others are chomping at the bit to get it. I think they're very safe. Fortunately, the complications associated with them, there have been some observations of severe allergic reactions, people anaphylaxing, and those are primarily people who've had previous allergies to a variety of things, but not only always, are reactions that can be treated. So people are asked to wait. For those of you who've been vaccinated, you've been asked to wait 15 minutes and you're watched. And I was talking actually to one of my son's teachers who said she was standing in line with another teacher for an hour or several hours, and then that person ended up on a stretcher because she had a severe allergic reaction. So there is that, but it was identified and it's being treated. There have been some reports of very rare immunologic antiplatelet reactions, but I don't believe that those are actually reactions. I've discussed it with several colleagues of mine who are real experts in this field. And, bad things happen to people, right? If you get the vaccine and you have a heart attack the next day, it doesn't mean that the vaccine caused the heart attack. So I think that fortunately that they seem very safe to me, certainly safer than risking getting COVID.
And whenever there's anything happening in great volume, there'll always be
Right.
some.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was talking again, all this is just what's called anecdotal, but a friend of mine was saying that a friend of hers fainted when he got the shot and broke his leg. Well,
It wasn't the vaccine that broke the leg, but
exactly. I don't think that's really but it is related. So, and then the question that, should we be concerned because these are new, this new technology of messenger RNA? I actually don't think so. So I've worked on the development of DNA vaccines, and I worry much more about them. So for those of you who are not scientists, which I assume is most of you, every cell in the body has a nucleus. And in that nucleus, the code that tells everybody what to do is DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. The molecule that brings those instructions out of the nucleus to the rest of the cell is called messenger RNA. And that's what the vaccine is. And then proteins are made with those instructions. So with DNA vaccines, you inject DNA and there's a chance of integration, which means the DNA could go into the person's DNA. But that doesn't happen with RNA. The RNA creates the instructions, it creates the code, it provides the information, and it's gone within about 15 minutes, about 15, 20 minutes. So I actually think it's an extremely safe technology. It has been regarded in the world of vaccines as safe, but not terribly efficacious. And before I was doing this, I actually went back to look at some of the things I'd said on previous discussions like this I've had. And I was saying, I really like the messenger RNA vaccines, but I think they're going to be safe. I don't think they're going to be so efficacious as perhaps the vectored vaccines, which are the J&J and the AstraZeneca. And I turned out to be wrong, which I'm delighted about. So no, I think they're very safe, and I think we're going to see them used. I think that, frankly, there's going to be a revolution. This business with the flu vaccine that's so substandard, there's not going to be an excuse for that anymore. And I think probably they're going to be used in oncology even not more readily, but to great effect, because it's a very, very plastic and flexible platform. And changes can be made easily, quickly, safely, and with high fidelity. So no, I actually think it's a huge breakthrough.
Okay,
I see
so
the question about, are you concerned that children will be more vulnerable as they stay unvaccinated and COVID mutates? Yes, I am. Don't you think they will be recommending vaccines for children and teens by fall? For sure. So I know both Pfizer and Moderna, and I assume J&J, though I don't actually know that, are testing their vaccines. And I could have this backwards. One is testing them down to 16. They're already approved in Israel for 16 to 18-year-olds. And so they're getting a lot of data from that. But they're being tested here in the US down to 16, and one, I think Moderna is down to 12, the NIH. So I would guess by the time school rolls around in the fall that these are going to be approved for children down to 6, say, I don't know, 6 or something, 8, something like that. When it comes to a risk analysis, fortunately, children are relatively safer than adults. There seems to be something that happens, and we don't know what it is. And again, this is one of the fascinating parts about the virus that happens as children get older that makes them more vulnerable. So once they get to be about 9, 10, then you start to see them getting sicker and into adolescence. So I think almost certainly by the time the next school year rolls around, they will be approved for. And I see Dr. Alan Manovitz asking, given the reports of mild cases of COVID in younger adults are showing some long-term symptoms post-COVID, is that a risk for asymptomatic children? It's a terrific question, and I don't know the answer. So this whole issue of long COVID is one of great mystery to me. It's obviously, not to be morbid, fascinating from a scientific and medical point of view, and tremendously challenging from a medical and personal point of view. So it doesn't appear to correlate with severity of disease. You would think, you were very sick and you continue to feel unwell. That doesn't seem to be the case. There are people who hardly knew they were infected and then ended up feeling, unwell for a very long time. Interestingly, there have been anecdotal reports, excuse me one second, I'm about to cough. Of individuals who have long COVID and who've been vaccinated and then feel better. That if you will, the focusing of the immune response to the spike protein, which is what the antigen in the vaccine is, somehow seems to improve their clinical course. Again, I haven't seen that published. I've just heard that from colleagues. I haven't heard of children with long COVID. I haven't seen it published. I don't know if others have, but certainly it's something that worries me. When you say that J&J may be more durable, do you mean in terms of its stability or how long its effectiveness lasts? No, it's certainly more stable. Durable, I mean the immunity. It may, the response may last longer in people, just because of the platform. The vector, the virus that it comes with, stimulates the immune system. It acts as what's called a vaccine adjuvant, and it may last longer. But we'll see. See. Okay, so here is the $10,000, the $1 million question. When do you think we'll be able to go back to a maskless society when 95% of the population has been vaccinated? Well, the good news is we're not going to need 95% of the population to be vaccinated to go back to a maskless society. All pandemics end. Even without the vaccine, the pandemic would end. Because what happens is when enough people develop immunity, either because they're infected or they've developed immunity from the vaccine, the virus has no place to go and it stops. So when that would be without the vaccine, I don't even want to think about how much, and this is what's called herd immunity, what percentage of the population needs to be immune for that to occur is a topic of great debate. But I don't know anybody who thinks it's 95%. The most conservative estimates I've heard are 70 to 75%. And it's not a binary thing. It's not there's herd immunity and there's no herd immunity. I think even at 40% of the population, you're going to start to see being immune, you're going to start to see the virus come down. And remember, a large number of people, probably depending on the area, in some areas, 30 to 40% of the people are immune from being previously infected. And so you can't add that to the number of people being vaccinated because there's overlap in those groups. But I just saw in the news tonight, 20% of New Yorkers have received at least one vaccine. So once you start getting to 40%, then you start talking about really seeing a diminution in the pandemic because of herd immunity. So I would say conservatively, when 70 or 75% of the population is immune, either through natural infection or vaccination, that's when it's really going to go away. And that's when we can really start to return to normal. But, I've been talking about this with my colleagues and thinking about this a lot. It's not just a science experiment, right? We've all been traumatized to greater or lesser degrees. And there are some people who are ready to throw off their masks. I mean, we see them on the news in Florida and Texas. And there are others of us, my mother and I are both vaccinated. We've both been vaccinated for weeks. We've seen each other outside masked, inside very well masked. We were together and she said to me, so can we take our masks off? I'm like, yeah, we can, according to the CDC, and I understand we can, we're both immune. We're not just the two of us. We left our masks on. We took them off to eat, but we're still used to it. And I think that kind of hesitation and cautiousness is actually wise. And I think it's going to be a slow process. And I think a colleague of mine was saying also, it's not going to be a binary thing. It's going to go from being where you wear a mask almost all the time, except, sometimes I'm on a block all by myself and I'll take my mask down so I can breathe without it, to where you'll be carrying a mask and you'll put it in your pocket when you feel you need it. And then I guess there's probably going to be a time in the next few years when we won't have them at all anymore. But I don't know when that will be. I think my own prediction, and this overlaps with that of others who are more expert than I, is that things are going to get slowly better. I think the next 6 weeks is really critical to continue to be vigilant. We all want this to be done. And like today was a beautiful day. It was spring and, I actually changed. I was wearing a black sweater and I've been, wearing black the whole last year. And I put on something pink because it was spring. And, there's this sense that things are better. People are out, it's bustling, the restaurants are, coming back. But for the next, 6 to 8 weeks till really more people get vaccinated and it gets warmer, I think we really have to be vigilant, wear our masks, keep distance, certainly gather with people who are vaccinated. if you're vaccinated. If you're not vaccinated, it's easy to let things slip when others are vaccinated. So I think it's important to keep that level of vigilance with the understanding it's a short time. We've done it this long. I always use the metaphor. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what happened at the end of World War One, but World War One ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and that's why we have Veterans Day on November 11th. And for whatever crazy reason, and I've never understood this, the powers that be, the generals, told the men to keep fighting, even though the armistice had been agreed to on the 10th, till the 11th hour when the bell sounded. Well, there were people who died on the 10th and the early morning of the 11th. They're just as dead as the people who died in the middle of the war. So I feel as though it's really, we've gotten this far, you want to make it to the end. It's really important to remain vigilant, to do the things that we need to do, what are called the non-pharmacologic interventions, the masks, the distancing, what was called the core four: masks, distancing, hand washing, and most important, staying home if you're sick, right? If you are unwell, stay home. Don't, as somebody who has spent my life as a doctor, soldiering through, this is not the year to do that. If you are unwell, stay home, have some soup. Don't expose others to what you have, even if it has nothing to do with COVID for right now. That will change in the next, few years. But these good practices and, opening your windows, I feel like and now it's pleasant to open your windows. We were opening windows in the middle of winter, but ventilation also turns out to be very important in protecting everybody. So as people get vaccinated, I think that's a tremendously important thing to do. And we're going to have to recover in other ways than just feeling protected. There's psychological impact. Again, I'm not expert on this other than I've experienced it, of being apart from people. One of the things that I feel really good about with the Harmonie Club, and we're all members, is it feels like a safe space to me in terms of there's being so conscientious about observing all the CDC guidelines, and there's enough space and few enough of us to keep distance. So I feel like that's a good place to sort of start with baby steps of going out into the world again. I think that it's going to take time, and I think we should give it time. But again, if everybody can have a vaccine by mid-May, we're going to be looking at a very different situation. And I fully believe that by September, we're going to be back in the theater. Now, I may be wearing a mask in the theater for a while, no matter what. I was saying to my husband, we'd love to go to the theater, that even if we go, I think I'm going to wear a mask. Now, I may feel differently about that, but I think there are going to be a lot of people who are going to feel that. So I think I'm just looking, are there other questions? Quick follow-up. What are your thoughts about how long the vaccines will be effective, and what might be the reality when we'll need booster shots or vaccines which have been developed for the mutations like we do now for the flu? That's again, one of these $100,000, $1 million questions. And there's a lot of variability about that. So interestingly, when you are in a place where there's a lot of virus, that virus boosts the immunity you get from a vaccine. So as virus is circulating, like if we're in New York and you're not being so careful, and like me, maybe you went into the diner or whatever, and you got exposed, you're protected by the vaccine. That actually boosts your immunity. So in areas where the virus is what's called endemic, protection will last longer. As the virus wanes, the protection will be shorter. I don't know how long. I mean, nobody knows. My strong guess is that we are going to get boosted next year for sure, no matter what, as a policy matter, because nobody knows. And then we're going to see what happens. Now, the other thing is there is there's long history, of developing vaccines and getting one vaccine and then getting another vaccine and then getting a more complicated vaccine. And the best example I can give of that, and many of you may remember this, is the polio vaccine. So the first polio vaccine that was developed, so polio was a plague, in many ways as devastating and differently devastating, but devastating like COVID, because it affected children and they died or were paralyzed. It was terrible. And there had been attempts to develop polio vaccines as early as the 30s. Some children died in the clinical trials. But so the Salk vaccine, which was the field trial results read out in 1955, was a whole killed vaccine. So it used a very basic technology, and it was a single viral strain. A year and a half later, the Sabin vaccine was developed, and that was a live attenuated vaccine, which is the drops most of us remember. That was much more efficacious. So when the Salk vaccine came out, everybody would get it, got it. I mean, it was, like the COVID vaccine, it was like gold. And then a year and a half later, when the Sabin vaccine rolled out, everybody got that one on top of it. And that boosted the Sabin one versus boosted the Salk one, which is called a prime boost strategy, which is, a tried and true way of establishing really good immunity. The original vaccines were to one serotype of polio, and the vaccines that are used now are to four. I should look it up, but I don't know the date of when each of the additional serotypes was added. And I'm quite certain that's going to happen with this. We're going to be getting, a cocktail of vaccines to different strains, even though right now the one that we got was the simplest. And that's just the nature of how vaccines get developed. So I think we can count on that. Whether long term we're going to need to get vaccinated every year like flu, I don't think so. Flu is a particularly challenging virus because it undergoes something called antigenic shift. All viruses undergo what's called antigenic drift, which is the mutations that we're seeing with the variants. But flu has these cassettes, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, that move in and out. And that's why you hear about like the H1N1 or H2N3. And they're vastly different. And so flu presents a very particular challenge. And my own view is there could be better flu vaccines, but that's a discussion for another day. Measles is among the most stable of viruses. COVID is not as stable as measles, but it's closer to measles than it is to flu in terms of its mutagenicity. So my strong hope is that eventually we will not need to be vaccinated every year, but in the near term, we're probably going to get boosted, I would think. If you have had COVID previously and you've had the vaccine, are your reactions worse? Yes. That's a very good question, and that's on my list of things to discuss. So people who've had COVID, and so if you get 2 shots, and for those of you who've had 2 shots, you almost certainly will have more of a reaction to the second shot. I got my first shot, my arm was a little sore, I had a bit of a headache, I was fine. Second shot, I was in bed for 2 days. I mean, I wasn't so sick, I was able to work a little bit, but I really felt crummy. And I've heard that from many, many people. About half the people who get the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine react. But if you've had COVID because you have a pre-existing immune response, the first shot is like the second shot for everybody else. And people can have quite strong reactions. It doesn't mean that you're sick again. It doesn't mean you have COVID. It means you're making a strong immune response. Currently, the FDA still is recommending 2 shots for people who've had COVID, but in other countries, in Israel and in the UK, they're only giving 1. And my understanding is they're looking at only giving 1 pretty seriously here as well, just for that reason. So the reason why somebody who's had COVID should get the vaccine is because you have a response to a whole bunch of different antigens. The vaccine gives you a really, really strong focused response to the spike protein. And that may be very important in preventing future infections. And so you want to get that advantage, but almost certainly you could get it with 1 shot. I mean, officially, I have to say I would recommend 2 shots because that's the current recommendation of the FDA, but I think that's being looked at. But don't be surprised. And don't be afraid to take Tylenol or even Advil. There were all these things like don't take it, but it's fine.
We see too about camp, which I think is a great note to conclude the evening on as we head into spring and then summer. And you and I had touched upon that as well. Should they be sending their kids to summer camp?
So let me and then before I do that, because that we're going to end on that because that's an up note. There's one thing that I would like to mention to people that I think sort of public service announcement thing. There are monoclonal antibodies, which are a wonderful new class of drugs that are available from Regeneron and Johnson & Johnson that are highly effective. And there was just they've been being used under an EUA but there was just a paper published in the New England Journal day before yesterday showing how effective they are at preventing severe disease and death and people at risk who are infected. So the way it goes, if you get COVID and you have a positive test, or you're symptomatic and you have a positive test, if you get these antibodies, and they have to be infused, they have to be given intravenously within the first 48 hours, they basically keep you from getting very sick. They may keep you from getting sick at all, but they certainly keep you from getting very sick, and they work tremendously well. There is no good medicine for COVID once you get sick. There are one drug, remdesivir, that's been approved, and then dexamethasone is useful if people are very sick. But these medicines keep you from getting sick, which is really what you want to do. So where 6 months ago, I would say if you had symptoms, I'd say, have some chicken soup and go to bed, because you really don't want to go to the hospital unless you absolutely have to. Now, if you think you have COVID or you've tested positive, reach out to your doctor. These antibodies are readily available. All of the hospitals, Lenox Hill, Sinai, New York Hospital, all have them. They're made by Regeneron and J&J. You might remember it's what President Trump got. He's, when he talked about the Regeneron, they really work. They save lives. So if in this interim period, anybody on this or anybody contracts it, it's really important to reach out to get them. So I just wanted to be sure that people know that. With regard to camp, like everything else, one has to decide it's a risk-benefit analysis. You have to think of what the risk is and what the benefit is. Fortunately, children don't tend to get very sick. They might get a little sick because they're not vaccinated. They might feel crummy for a few days. So, the risk is your kid is away at camp and they're in the infirmary and they feel crummy. But I think of all things to do, it's a very safe one. And last year, the camps demonstrated that they really were able, those that were open, and observed the guidelines. So the guidelines are very strict about people not coming and going. We're really able to have, I think, wonderful experiences for the children who attended at a time when children who, like my son, who was at home, were living in a bubble on Zoom. I will also tell you, for whatever it's worth, Ellie and I have an almost 10-year-old who'll be 10 next week, and he is signed up for Camp Ramah in the Berkshires. So we're looking forward to him going there. We've been advised by them that there's no visiting day, parents can't come onto the premises and all of that, which is disappointing for us. He'll be happy with it, but I think my own view is camps are one of the safest, fun activities to pursue.
It's like living in a bubble for 2 months.
Right, exactly.
Test negative and then enjoy your summer. 10 for 2, like kids say.
Right. Is it test negative and think positive? That's what I hear them say on the news.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank you all very much. I really appreciate your attention and your questions. And I look forward to seeing you all at the Harmonie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Hirschfeld Schlesinger, vice versa.
Schlesinger Hirschfeld. Sarah is fine. that it works much better.
President Lynn Tobias for introducing us. That was so nice and so informative. And I think it's safe to say that everyone has left this conversation more informed and feeling hopeful for a brighter 2021. And thank you so, so very much for your time this evening. And tonight, I guess now it's time for Mr. President.
Right. We've got 2 minutes to get a glass of wine.
Exactly.
Can I just interject? This is Lynn Tobias, that we should all feel very proud to have Sarah as a member of Harmonie. And we thank you for sharing your expertise with us tonight. It was terrific.
Lynn, thank you very much. And Lynn was on the admissions committee when my dear husband and I, Ellie, came to meet with the admissions committee. And every time we see you, we bless your name because you were so kind to us. And we were so happy to be members of the club. We really are one of a great happiness for us to be part of this community. So thank you very much, and thank you for having me.